Good afternoon, everybody. This is Mr. Williams here, your friendly AP US Government and Politics teacher. Today I'm here to speak with you guys about Chapter 1. Now, when you come into my unit slides, which are located on my website, you'll ultimately see that it's divided up by chapters. And those chapters are subdivided into a series of different questions. And in Chapter 1, we're going to be looking at three core questions. Now, the first question of Chapter 1 is ultimately, what is the difference between government and politics? Now, many folks have gotten used to calling my class AP Gov, and even I've been guilty of that at times, but it's important to note that they are separate from one another. Government is not the same thing as politics, and the way to think about government is that the government is the what, whereas politics is the how, and let me clarify what I mean by that. When you're looking at whether or not you are residing in a country with a constitutional monarchy or a parliamentary system or a presidential system, or whether or not your country has a constitution or doesn't, those are all questions about government, okay, the structure of the group that's ultimately ruling or representing the people in that nation. Politics, however, is something different, and this quote really sums it up well. Who gets what, when, and how? In other words, whatever kind of system you're in, there are groups that are vying for power within that country. Those could be those close to the king or the president, or those could be those at the bottom. Those could be in the middle middle class. There are a variety of different groups that represents. But again, not everybody's going to get the same thing in any given system there. Some are going to get more, some are going to get less, and some are going to use some means of getting that power, and other groups are going to use others. And that's the politics part of what it is that we're going to be exploring this year. Now, again, when we're looking at government, we're looking at that structure. And please do not forget this. With legislative, this top area, pay close attention to it. The legislative branch is responsible for making those laws. The executive branch is responsible for carrying those laws out. And the judicial branch is responsible for interpreting the laws or determining whether or not the laws are constitutional or not. And it is critical, at least in our government, that those three branches remain separate from one another. And that speaks to the structure of the government or government itself. Governments have specific functions too, and I want to speak to each of those very, very quickly because we're going to be looking at each of these throughout the course of the year. Now, you can bet that any government or any system is going to be required from its people to protect them from foreign invasions. And they need a system of enforcement and the courts that can ultimately help put people away in prison or keep them separate from the rest of society, keep people safe. They'll also be expecting, and the people residing under this government will be expecting a certain amount of services provided to them. Some governments provide a great deal of service for their people. There are some less so. But whether or not that comes in the form of a universal healthcare system or retirement benefits, those are the sorts of things that governments are expected to provide. In addition to that, they're responsible for educating the youth. Some countries take a very nationalistic approach, and the primary emphasis of education is about getting them to appreciate and love their country above all else, and shove other sorts of information aside. Hopefully in this country, we're exposed to a few more different types of ideas, and it isn't simply indoctrination or forcing our government's views of what we should be learning about down our throats, but socializing the youth is an aspect of that. And finally, they need to have a means of paying for all this stuff, so they have to have the ability to collect taxes. Now, the American political culture is pretty unique. One of the things that's made the enforcement right now quite difficult of mask mandates or requirements for people to stay quarantined or on lockdown, part of the reason why that's so difficult is that Americans really believe in individualism, that I get to make my own decisions. I have my own belief systems there. And that's tied to another part of our culture, tied to liberty. It's this idea that we need protection from government. It's not their right to take those powers away. Liberty is ultimately about that. And there's also a belief in liberty of our markets. So there's a free market belief over here, and that's sometimes called laissez-faire. But sometimes what's contradictory to that particular part of our culture is this notion of equality. On one hand, we want the American people to be able to have the ability to make billions of dollars. On the other hand, The idea that some are making billions and other people are homeless really bothers some folks, or the idea that some people are able to vote quite easily there and some other folks might not have the same access to the vote really is problematic. Obviously, things like the pay gap are another aspect of that. And a fifth component of our political culture really speaks to the idea of popular sovereignty, which we'll be getting to more in the next chapter. But it's the idea that government is there for the people, it is there to serve the people. So that is where I will stop.